Hello, everybody. My name is Chiara. Welcome to the Party Center and to our new series, Theories of Consciousness. Over 3 weekends, we will explore the heart of consciousness science, its current states and future prospects. We would like to take the opportunity to thank Alex Gomez-Marin and Francesco Ellia, the curators and chairs of this event. Today's event is entitled The Philosophy of Consciousness Science. Francesco Ellia is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Bologna and an honorary fellow at the Center for Sleep and Consciousness of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received a PhD in philosophy, science, and cognition from the University of Bologna. And with that, a warm welcome to you, Francesco.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I will share my presentation. Okay. Okay, yeah, you should be.
Yeah, that looks great. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so welcome, everybody. As Chiara said, today we start this series for 3 weekends. It's titled Theories of Consciousness, Making Sense of a Field in Revolt and Revolution. And why is that? Because consciousness science is going through very interesting, but also a bit turbulent times. This is also because the field saw an incredibly fast evolution over the 3 past decades. Where consciousness at the time was something that retired Nobel Prize would undertake as an interest, but it was even actively discouraged for younger researchers to work in this field, right? Because it was considered a little bit fringe science, something like not very scientific. Then in 30 years, thanks to technological advancement on the one side and conceptual maybe on the other, the field sort of exploded. We should say maybe that is still not maybe the most mainstream aspect of modern neuroscience, but there is definitely an incredible amount of work and much more every day that gets added to this work. So and we went from a situation where perhaps we didn't have enough signal, and maybe now we are in a situation when there is too much noise. So we gathered some people, some very renowned expert of the fields, and me, and we will explore different conceptual aspects, but also empirical one, and that aims to give at least a partial overview of the state of the art, what are the issues that we face, what are the solutions that have been proposed, and what are all the different aspects that are relevant for the science of consciousness, or the neuroscience of consciousness. So you see, as you probably know, because you're here, this is the timetable for the next 3 weekends. There will be 2-hour session every Saturday and Sunday. We will start with me today. Then tomorrow we will have Professor Liad Mudrik, which will talk about this very interesting and massive project that she's one of the people in charge of, which is which is the so-called adversarial collaboration between different theories, and she will provide us with some conceptual tools to comparing and testing neuroscientific theories of consciousness. Then next week, we will have Maxwell Ramstad with us. And by the way, there has been a swap. Originally, Maxwell Ramstad was supposed to come at a later weekend. So if you weren't aware of that, check the calendar. And it will talk with us about the free energy principle and the inner screen model. The free energy principle is a very interesting approach that use a formal framework to address cognition and consciousness as well, but it has also much broader implication, and I'm very excited to see what Maxwell will have to tell us about that. Then we will have on the same week, on the Sunday, Professor Anna Chalnika, which will talk with us about the bodily root of conscious experiences in early life. I think this is another very important topic that hasn't drawn so much attention, at least for now, from the community, but I think this is something extremely important. So I'm very excited that she will share research with us. Then the next week we will have Johannes Kleiner, which will talk about the so-called structural turn that is probably happening right now, or I mean, it will tell us exactly why he believes it's happening now and not before. But it is the structural turn is the idea that mathematical structures are necessary to provide clear and precise explanations, and in fact we have seen more and more formal approaches to consciousness, mathematical approaches to consciousness coming up in the recent years. So this is another topic I'm extremely interested. And finally, we will have Matteo Grasso, who will talk about integrated information theory, methodology, foundation, and explanation. By the way, me and Matteo Grasso have been colleagues in the past, so I will also give a very short introduction on integrated information theory at the end of my talk. But if you find anything interesting about it, you should definitely attend this talk, because he's one of the people that is actually developing the theory, and he can certainly do a much better job than I could in explaining integrated information theory in all the details, at least. So today we start with my presentation, and hopefully also a discussion altogether. And by the way, yes, okay, I can have the chat here, perfect. So my goal for this talk, I know a lot of you work professionally in the field of consciousness, so and probably many of you for much longer than I did so far. But I also know that a lot of people just came here because they want to listening to something they're maybe not as familiar with, right? That I expect there is a bit of everything in this public. So I aim for clarity in my talk, like to clarify all the words that I'm using, what I mean by them, but also to use general and broad terms without going too much into the technical details. And this is because my goal was to provide an overview of the what I would call some or maybe the foundational issue in the field of consciousness science. So if anything that I'm saying is not clear, please use the chat and like ask a question, or like ask what you mean by that, or can you clarify that? And I will try to do my best to monitor the chat as I'm talking and provide an answer in real time. If you have more complex questions, you can also write them in the chat, but we will get to them later for the second part of this event, which will be hopefully more of a discussion rather than me just talking to you. So with that, I thank you again, and I must confess it warms my heart to see so many people joining us on a Saturday evening or day, wherever, depending where you are in the world, and taking some of their time to come together and do this thing together, and it's really beautiful, I think. So without further ado, the philosophy of consciousness science. Now, I must confess the title is a bit of a clickbait, because it definitely sounds arrogant to say the philosophy of consciousness science, right? Perhaps there are different philosophy within the consciousness science, right? Actually, I'm pretty sure there are. So maybe a philosophy for consciousness science would be a more appropriate title. But the thing is that I'm gonna talk mostly about one problem that I believe almost everyone that works in this field consider to be an essential, a foundational problem for consciousness science. And therefore, I don't think it's completely out of the place to say the philosophy of consciousness science. But keep in mind that the second half of my talk, part 3 and 4, will be more about my personal view about consciousness science, which I don't have the expectations that everyone will agree with me. And in fact, I think it's gonna be more fun if someone disagree with me. So feel free to comment about that. So just a second, because okay. So part 1 is the mind-body problem, which, as I mentioned, I believe is the problem. And I also believe that a lot of people would agree with me, although they will have different feelings on how to deal with that. So, as I said, I aim for clarity in this talk. And in general, I prefer to be understood rather than to be particularly original or creative, but because I think if we understand each other, we can communicate. If we can communicate, then we can criticize each other, but criticize on the exact point that we want to criticize, and not to a sort of fake, weaker idea. So I will try again, as I mentioned, to be clear about what I mean by terminology. And for today, just I will use consciousness, mind, phenomenal consciousness, phenomenal mind as exact synonyms. So if you see one of these words, they all mean the same thing, right? And I will try to explain what I mean by that later. And so some people that are more familiar with the philosophical literature about consciousness may know that there is a very well-known difference between phenomenal consciousness and access consciousness. But for today, I ask you to put that in a box, at least for the next 2 hours. And let's not talk about access consciousness, or maybe let's talk about it in the discussion. And also, I'm sure when I say consciousness is mind, many people cringe in in their seat and say, how can consciousness be the mind when the mind has a conscious part and unconscious part? Well, personally, I have some ideas about that, but I also won't go into that today, or maybe we can discuss about it later. So also set aside everything that relates to unconscious thinking, unconscious process, unconscious mind in general. All right. So let's start with this quote that I particularly like, because I think not because it's a particularly brilliant quote, but because it's a rather old quote. It's from 140 years ago. And Thomas Huxley, that some of you may know that it was called like the Hound of Darwin, like it was a fervent Darwinist. He famously wrote this sentence: "How is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the djinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp in the story." And the reason I say I like this quote because it's an old quote is because 140 years later, and keep in mind, this was written when antibiotics didn't exist, or a lot of things that are extremely common for us today didn't even exist, weren't discovered yet, right? So a lot of things happened in this 140 year roughly, and yet there is a sense in which our knowledge about the brain increase enormously, like exponentially, but at the same time, we are in the same exact position of Huxley during those days. Maybe, hopefully, some of the speakers in the coming session will contradict me, will say that I'm wrong about that. We are actually closer to an answer to that. But I believe essentially we are more or less in the same position. Like we don't have anything that resemble a definitive theory that is also has a extensive body of empirical confirmation. I will suggest that maybe one theory, but maybe we have one theory, and tomorrow Professor Mudrik will talk more into details about 4 different theories. So maybe there will be a debate about that, but I believe that this is essentially still true. So what is consciousness, or at least what I mean by that? Consciousness is that thing that is there during the day, that fades away as we fall into a dreamless sleep, and comes back several times during the night as we're dreaming. In other words, consciousness is experience. So what consciousness is not, or at least what I don't think we should mean by consciousness. Consciousness is not language, and it doesn't even require language. Consciousness is not self-awareness. It's not a sense of self. A sense of self is not needed in consciousness, and I'll explain why. It's not memory. It's not interacting with the environment. As I mentioned, we do have experiences while we're dreaming, right? But we are completely disconnected from our environment. We are in an entire world of our own. It's not even wakefulness, because as I mentioned, we can have experience as we're dreaming, as we are sleeping while dreaming. And it's not even intelligent behavior. What I mean by intelligent behavior is like, we don't need to do anything from an outside point of view in order to have consciousness, right? And so, for example, it's why consciousness is not memory. Certainly memory enriches our conscious experience and play a very important role in it. But it's not that if we can easily imagine that if we would be to lose all our memories, we still have conscious experience, right? And at the same time, we don't need a proper sense of self to have conscious experience. And I am sure most of you, or actually probably all of you, at some point in your life, you played maybe some sport, or maybe some game of chess, or maybe you were reading a book or something that was so intense and took so much of you that you sort of forget that you were there, that you were yourself, right? You were completely absorbed by the moment. You were completely in the moment. Maybe some of you meditate, right? And sometimes when you meditate, your own sense of self can somehow fade away, or maybe goes away completely. So these things are not what I mean by consciousness, although again, they may enrich consciousness enormously. They may play some very important role in consciousness, but they're not consciousness per se. In a sense, again, consciousness is the precondition for many of those things to be there. And a philosopher and neuroscientist, Attila Revansuo, wrote this quote that I think is it gives the idea of what I mean by that. And he wrote that in its barest essence, phenomenal consciousness constitutes an inner presence, the simple presence or occurrence of experiential qualities, that is, no self is required, no representing, no intentionality, no language, no concept, only the sub-phenomenal space in which phenomenal qualities may become present. There is a little bit of philosophical jargon, but I believe it's pretty clear if we take it at face value. Okay, so again, what do I mean by consciousness? When I say consciousness, I mean subjective experience. And there is a very famous paper. I really like this picture, and I couldn't have but put it in the presentation. Conscious experience is a widespread phenomenon. It occurs at many levels of animal life. But no matter how the form may vary, the fact that an organism has conscious experience at all means basically that there is something it is like to be that organism. And this is a quote by Thomas Nagel from his 1974 paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat, which is one of the most seminal paper in the recent history of philosophy. And this definition that sounds a bit weird if you're not used to it, that there is something, it is like to be that thing. I think it's pretty well accepted, at least within the community that works about that. It's something that pretty clearly conveys what we mean by consciousness. Now, the mind-body problem. What is the mind-body problem? The mind-body problem is a metaphysical issue, which means it's not something that we can necessarily solve by doing experiment, by doing hard science. It's something more of it's something that goes beyond that. It's something that it's a bit of a conceptual level, right? And it's the problem of how do we relate the physical world and the mental world. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people may have the temptation to say that this is a sort of a false dichotomy, because it's a sort of a false problem, because the fact that it's not necessary that the two things are separated, right? But that's exactly the problem that we want to address here. So the reason we care about this issue is because we want to know how to fit our subjective experience into our objective description of the world. We basically want to have something that is scientific and that explain why our subjective experience is the way it is. And the real reason I would say we want to do that is because subjective experience is what guides most of our ethical decision. When we have, for example, patients, the really thing we care the most about is whether or not they're suffering, right? Or if they can recover, and or if, so to say, there is still someone there is still a person, or it is just a body now. And similarly, for example, for animals, this raises a lot of ethical issues, like intensive farming it's something probably bad, because we assume that all these animals have subjective experience. If those animals wouldn't have subjective experience, one could argue that it wouldn't be necessarily so bad to mistreat them the way we do, unfortunately. And by the way, there are a lot of philosophical arguments that actually says that this is not necessarily the case. But I believe that for the average person, the possibility of subjective experience, the possibility of pain, the possibility of suffering are very important and are what guides some of our ethical decision. For example, I know a lot of people that maybe they're vegetarian, but they eat fish, and you ask why you're a vegetarian but you eat fish, and they say, well, because fish don't have this complex nervous system, so probably they don't really suffer, so we can eat them, and so on and so forth. There is a problem with the mind-body problem. There is a problem within the problem, we could say, and that is that subjective experience, by definition, cannot be directly observed by an independent observer. So it's not the best subject for science, right? Because as we all know, science is something that studying in an objective way, objective phenomena, and is somehow not dependent by the observer. So it's not really important if I do an experiment or you do an experiment, or at least it shouldn't be. What is important is that that we can have indeed this kind of observation. Yet, consciousness, if we really think about it, is the only thing that individually we have direct access to. So I have direct access to my conscious experience, and it's the only thing that I have direct access to. And the same applies, I assume, because I cannot verify, I cannot somehow enter in your mind and know what you think and what you feel. But again, I assume that you have the same experience. And we are in exactly my same position. Like, it's the first thing that you know, and everything else is inferred within your conscious experience. To make a very silly example, or like analogy maybe, is like when you go to a conference and you go with your colleagues and you go in your room, you don't need to visit your colleague's room to assume they look very similar to your own room, right? Because you've been to different hotels in your life, and you know hotels usually have the same kind of rooms. So if your rooms looks that way, you're paying the same price, so it must look pretty much similar to the one of your colleague. Of course, it's different because then you can go inside the room of your colleague to check and verify if the two rooms are indeed similar. So that is part of the problem, that everything I've ever known or that I will ever be able to know is accessible to me through my own subjective experience, and I cannot go beyond that. And you cannot access my own experience. In other words, we could say that consciousness is the upper bound of knowledge. If something is not possible within our knowledge, we simply cannot experience it. We cannot experience it. And if we cannot experience it, then we just cannot know about it. And I believe some of you would say, for example, I don't know, atoms or black holes, or, you know, all these things, we do not experience them directly, but we can make a pretty good sense of them thanks to various forms of abstractions, like mathematical equations, maybe. And this is certainly true. But what are mathematical abstractions? They are still part of your experience. At the end of the day, you can kick the bucket up until a point, but then there must be a consciousness that experiences that thing, right? So, as I mentioned, even if I cannot be sure that you are all conscious exactly the same way I'm conscious, and that, for example, for you, the taste of chocolate is exactly like for me is the taste of chocolate, I think it's a pretty reasonable inference to assume so, because we share an evolutionary history, we share a development history, and for the biggest part, we also share, for example, similar up to a point cultural background, right? So we speak language, like if you're here, you certainly can speak English, so we can understand each other. So we have a lot of we have more in common that we normally think about. So I can make this inference, but what happens when I want to make inferences about cases that are less obvious than the one I just mentioned? For example, what about newborns that maybe we will hear in the coming weeks? Or what about brain injured patients, like patients that are not responsive, obviously? How do we know which kind of experience, and if any, they're having, right? And things get even more complicated if we go further down the line. So, for example, what about, I don't know, other mammals that they do have a very similar, they have a similar brain to ours, not that, but, you know, we don't know much because we cannot even directly communicate with them. They cannot speak with us. And what about very strange animals like an octopus, right? An octopus is so incredibly strange, but it doesn't even have a proper brain. All these neurons are spread all across its body, but it's capable of extremely intelligent behavior. It's very social. It's probably octopi dreams, because we observe some phenomena that could look like REM sleep in octopus, like when they use their mimetic skills in a very random way. That could be like our random eye movement phase. What about, for example, insects or like bees, you know, like all these things, like where do we set the line? And similarly, and even more complicated, what about artificial system, like artificial intelligence that these days everyone is talking about, or robots, or even brain organoids. Brain organoids are basically lab-grown cells, like neuronal cells. And the interesting thing is that if you leave them enough time, they start to behave not so differently from certain cell within our own brain. So is the organoid, is this, sort of real brain in a vat experiencing anything? And if so, what? All of these are puzzling and fascinating question, I think. But as you can imagine, they're extremely hard to face, right? And why they are so hard to face? Because as we all learn in graduate school, correlation is not causation. So even if we can imagine that, even if we were able to find a perfect, like a very strong correlation between consciousness and brain states, which is the current, is one of the current goals in this field, the quest for neural correlates of consciousness. And even if we actually had that tomorrow, how, in what way this thing could be helpful to make inferences, for example, about an AI? I would say it would definitely be very helpful, but it wouldn't provide the conclusive answer to us, right? And we could say like it's inferential power, so the power to make inference with this kind of information would progressively diminishing as we move from those more ambiguous cases that I mentioned earlier, and there are many other, by the way. So I say, like, perhaps we should follow a sort of a Aristotelian approach, right? Start with what we know best, like our own subjective experience at an individual level, and gain enough knowledge that allows to make us inference in cases that are less known to us, right? So again, what I said in the beginning, thanks to my own experience, I can make some reliable inference about your experience. But the more we go down the line, like this line that I pictured before, the more this become ambiguous. Okay, so let me do a very short overview of the history of consciousness science. And this is a paraphrase. Perhaps some of you remember a similar quote. The original quote was about psychology. And in the beginning of the 20th century, someone said, I don't remember exactly who now, but someone said that psychology has a very short history because it was a new science effectively, but a very long prehistory, right? Because for thousands of years, philosophers have been debated themes that then became topics of psychology. So the same is true about consciousness science. And even if we set aside for a moment all the philosophical debates that started at the really probably way earlier than we have proof of, because there is no way that our ancestor didn't have at least some of these questions, we still have a fairly recent science, because as I mentioned in the very beginning, it's something that's been happening for the past 30 years, and it's happening like a sort of an explosion, an exponential explosion. But at the same time, there is some prehistory, right? It's something that the research, so to say, about subjective experience was very present in the beginning of scientific psychology, right? And here there are just some example of some thinkers that consider phenomenology an essential aspect of psychology and something that should have been explained scientifically within their field. Gustav Fechner, William Wundt, and William James, that probably all of you know about. But then something happened. Behaviorism in the first half of the 20th century became the major school of thought, so to say, within scientific psychology. John Watson, I really cannot tell if he said that without irony, because to me it's almost inconceivable to say something like that. But he wrote this quote that is he didn't say consciousness doesn't exist, as sometimes is said about behaviorists. He said, yeah, it's possible that it exists, but it has never been seen, touched, smelled, tasted, or moved. Basically, he said, consciousness, no one ever experienced consciousness, but consciousness is literally experience, right? So I found this a bit puzzling. Again, the slides are okay, working now. So basically, the operating manner in which behaviorism worked was to transform psychology in a proper hard science. And a science, as I mentioned, according to a lot of people, is something that cares about objective items, so to say, objective phenomena. And maybe if we will have time, we will go back to this word later. And therefore, the only thing that you can study from an outside perspective is behavior. You can see the stimuli, the responses, and everything that happens in between is a sort of a black box, right? Later, in the second half of the 20th century, a different approach started to emerge. And what we could call functionalism, that there is a very strong overlapping between different things like functionalism, cognitivism, and other things. But in an essence, what happened is that people realized that you cannot have anything that is that resemble a proper full-fledged science of the mind if you don't involve the mind in some capacity, at least, right? So they said we need to consider the internal states and their functional role in cognition. But consciousness per se was still problematic. Consciousness, subjectivity, it's something that, you know, sounded a bit fringe. And also because behaviorism has been so popular in the earlier decades, even the word consciousness was somehow banned by the mainstream debate. Now, it's not completely true that no one ever used the word consciousness. Actually, it's false, I would say, within the scientific environment, because of course philosophers were talking about consciousness all the time. You know, consciousness was somehow set aside. People prefer to talk about like cognition, and therefore, you know, the centrality of consciousness was completely lost once again. And this was, as I say, like I called it functionalism, cognitivism, but it was a very big endeavor that included research from many different fields, psychology, linguistic philosophy, computer science. These are the years in where artificial intelligence was born, right? And they started to somehow converge on at least some research goals, maybe some methods, maybe some assumptions. And again, this was also like behaviorism. This was somehow a successful movement. Like it provided an incredible amount of insights about the sciences of the mind, but still it didn't really consider consciousness as central. And we can say in a sense that what this approach did was to open the black box of behaviorism and replace it with many smaller black box, right? And so you basically, at this time, you have the stimulus, then something happened in the stimulus, and you create basically an abstract model to describe that, and then you have a response. And so it's still something that seems pretty much objective and therefore legitimately scientific, but you are also considering the inner states and their functional roles in cognition. Finally, by the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, there were several breakthroughs in technological development, and also new conceptual tools, in a sense, were presented. And therefore, the brain was now a very important protagonist of this scientific endeavor. and it was possible to study the brain in a programmatic way. Now, again, this was a time where consciousness was still considered something fringe, something not properly scientific, a little bit of a fantasy that, you know, like we will never solve, we will never have clear answers, so why we should waste time on it. But some very, very established scientists like Nobel Prize laureates Francis Crick and Gerald Edelman, they started to be very interested about consciousness. They took consciousness seriously. And in fact, the sentence "scientific attack on consciousness" is from Francis Crick, who had this beautiful way to beautiful writing style, even though I don't agree with most of his deepest intuition, but it's just a joy to read. And in fact, since I put a screenshot of this paper that some people, many people consider like a sort of a starting point of the modern field of consciousness science. And the paper is from 1990, just to give you a sense of how recent this thing is. You know, I was born in 1990, so it's something very, very close to us. And, you know, just read the first sentence. It is remarkable that most of the work in both cognitive science and the neuroscience make no reference to consciousness or awareness, especially as many would regard consciousness as the major puzzle confronting the neural view of the mind, and indeed, at the present time, it appears deeply mysterious to many people. And this was 30 years ago, right? So the word consciousness basically started to came back in the scientific debate at about that time. And Francis Crick, as I mentioned, play an instrumental role in that, along with his close collaborator, Christoph Koch, which is now one of the most respected neuroscientists working on consciousness. And, and Crick presented this astonishing hypothesis. And by the way, I have a little trivia about that. You must know that Francis Crick was, as I mentioned, he had beautiful writing style, and he was extremely capable of also communicating science, not only making revolution in every field he came across, but also communicating it. And many years earlier, he also proposed an expression that became quite instrumental in biology, which was the central dogma of molecular biology, right? And many of you probably know about it. But the fun thing is that Crick was, I think, the perfect blueprint of what a scientist should be like. He was extremely skeptical. He didn't accept anything as a truth unless he could, you know, have definite confirmation of it. So when he proposed the expression, the central dogma, he wasn't fully aware of the meaning of dogma. And later he said he regretted that. So it's fun to notice that when many years later, he proposed the astonishing hypothesis, he used the word hypothesis, like to highlight the speculative nature of this point, right? And by the way, these are very strong assumption and working hypotheses. And basically, the two central points were, as you can read, that every aspect of consciousness should somehow explainable in neural terms at the neuronal level. And it is likely that there is one common mechanism that underlines most, if not all, aspects of consciousness, right? So basically, you look into the brain, you figure something out, and then from there, you again can make inferences and working out the other aspects, even those that look more mysterious, like self-awareness and things like that. So yet, even at this stage, Crick was a bit skeptical that this was even possible, that was possible to completely explain consciousness. And now he used the word qualia, which are, in a nutshell, we could say that are the subjective qualities that we were talking in the beginning, right? So it wasn't even completely sure that this was possible in principle. And maybe we just have to live with this limitation he wrote in his book. At about this time, like when Crick published the astonishing hypothesis, a neuroscience of consciousness was gaining momentum, and philosopher David Chalmers proposed a distinction between easy problems of consciousness and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problem are basically those problems that are vulnerable, so to say, to explanation that traditionally are employed by natural sciences, including neuroscience, of course. But the hard problem seems to be something entirely different, like qualitatively different. Now, it's not about like having enough data. It's about like a completely different kind of explanation. And the easy problems basically are those problems that once we specify the computational or neural mechanism that perform the function that we want to explain, then we're done, right? We don't need to do any extra work. An example of the easy problems could be, for example, access consciousness that I said that I wouldn't mention, but I am now mentioning, reports, attention, memory, and other stuff. This time of explanation is unproblematically physical, since it implies an account of the explanandum, so the thing that we want to explain, in terms of physical processes. So that's, not easy in the sense that it's, something that we can easily do. All of these issues, many of these issues are still pretty much open. But at least we know in principle what would be a good methodology to address and hopefully solve all of them. And we don't have any particular preoccupation that there will be something left that we cannot account for. But when it comes to the hard problem of consciousness, which is basically the problem to explain what it's like to be us in physical terms, in other words, basically the problem of explaining experience itself, the problem to explain why certain physical processes that arguably happen in the brain are accompanied by subjective qualities, while other processes that still happen in the brain, they do not have any subjective feeling that comes with them, so to say. So, in other words, why does a specific experience feel the way it does and not some other way? Why, when I taste coffee, it tastes like coffee and it doesn't taste like chocolate, right? It's just a matter of physical element interacting, or there is indeed something more, something that has to do with our with the subjective nature of consciousness. Personally, but I think many share this, the hard problem doesn't have too much to do with the fact that certain experience seems ineffable, meaning that they, like certain experiences are extremely difficult to be described, right? How would you even try to describe a certain kind of pain that you had last month, for example? Our language definitely has shortcomings when it comes to explain very specific aspect of our subjective experience, but I don't think this is the issue here. I think the issue is way more profound. Yeah, so to summarize, the hard problem of consciousness is the problem to explain how the physical brain generates the phenomenal mind. This is more or less the way the problem is understood nowadays. And by the way, this is not the way Chalmers himself explained the problem. Chalmers provided a very extremely sophisticated, extremely complex, something maybe even unnecessary philosophical argument to sort of justify the hard problem, basically, like the complexity of the hard problem. So, but this more or less is the way people, what people mean nowadays when they talk about the hard problem, like how the brain generates consciousness, right? And notice the difference between what I said earlier, the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is somehow metaphysically agnostic, right? Because it says there is a mind, there is a body, like how do they relate? Maybe they're the same thing, and just prima facie we're not able to see, like at face value we're not able to see. Or maybe they are two separate things and therefore they are related in some very mysterious way, at least for now. But it doesn't, when we talk about the mind-body problem, we generally don't presuppose that one supervene on the other. When we talk about the art problem of consciousness, I suspect most people actually do that. They think, well, the brain is something that that is given for granted, and is given for granted that the brain somehow produces consciousness. And there is absolutely a sense in which this is beyond controversy. There are criticism, of course, to the art problem of consciousness. I just took two, but you can really find countless papers that reject the art problem in the most creative way. None of that is extremely convincing, to be honest. Like, I think you ask anyone and you ask them, has someone found a solution to the art problem? And they will tell you, well, there are countless solutions, but you know, there is no consensus on any of them specifically. And two criticism that I just took two as an example, as I mentioned. Neuroscientist Anil Seth in 2016 wrote about what he called the real problem of consciousness, right? And the real problem of consciousness, according to him, is that it, you know, like to solve the art problem of consciousness is not a qualitative. We do not need a qualitatively different solution, but it's rather a problem of quantity. We need more empirical work. We need more experiment. We need more data. We just know so little about the brain that we cannot hope to provide an answer to such a big problem, right? So basically, set this problem aside. Let's keep on with the hard empirical work, and eventually the problem will dissolve itself. I have my personal doubts about that, but yeah, I just want to provide a little bit of different. Oh, yeah, I see there is a very good question in the chat. Yes, I agree with you, and we will come back to it later during the discussion, if that is fine. Perfect. So another criticism about the art problem, in a sense, which is somehow along the same line of Seth, comes from Cohen and Dennett in 2011, where they basically say, again, to have a scientific theory of consciousness, something that can be called scientific, we need we just need functions. Everything that goes beyond functions, so some fuzzy concepts like subjective experience, they don't really bring much to the table, and therefore we should set them aside. We should focus on the functions, such as attention, working memory, decision-making, blah, 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 and figure out how these functions coming together, they solve the mind-body problem. Now, I'm really not convinced by that. And why I'm not convinced by that? Because again, sorry, are we looking? Okay, we will come to the chat later. We will come back to the chat later. So my question is there perhaps a widespread bias in consciousness science? Like, if we all agree that the explanandum of a scientific theory of consciousness should be experience, and that's a very big if, then are we doing it? Are we explaining subjective experience? Or instead, by leaving subjectivity outside of the picture, we are misled by a substitution bias, and a substitution bias is defined as Kahneman by something that when we face a very difficult question, we often answer to an easier one instead. This is something natural, comes quite natural to us. And usually, and this is the real problem where the bias comes in, we do not noticing that we are substituting one question for another, right? So that's a bit of a problem. And I believe this could be a problem that is currently in the field. And again, I'll be very happy if the speaker in the coming session will somehow prove me wrong, right? Now, I think actually there is a root cause for this impasse, so to say. And this root cause lies within a text, which is one of the foundational texts of modern science, written by Galileo Galilei almost four centuries ago. And the essayer was, it's an incredible book, by the way. It's a book that, it's a treatise on astronomy to set a dispute about comets. So you might be confused by the fact that I think this is the root cause of the problems we are facing today in consciousness science, right? But there is a reason why I'm bringing this up, because first of all, this is a foundational text for the modern scientific thinking. And second of all, because in this text, Galileo was aiming to define what is a physical body, right? And this because in the Aristotelian science that was common before the times of Galileo, the idea was that in the word, all the qualities. So the taste of chocolate, it wasn't in my mind, but it was in the chocolate itself. So when I came in contact with the chocolate, there was this interaction, but the qualities were out there in the words. So Galileo basically refused this worldview, and he provided an argument with two critical elements. On the one hand, he believed that the Aristotelian method was too much based on logic, philosophy, and abstraction, and instead we need a method that is bounded by empirical observation. And on the other hand, he introduced a distinction that has been incredibly influential for the century to come, especially in philosophy, which is the distinction between the primary properties and the secondary qualities. So, sorry, again. Okay, so the idea is simple. And basically, Galileo said, if, an object, what it is an object? An object is a bundle of primary properties, properties that are objective, that are usually characterized in mathematical terms. And then our own mind, our own imagination, put on top of them other properties, or better to say, secondary qualities, right? So the mind can, again, as an exercise with through imagination, strip away those properties, those subjective properties, and restitute a bundle of primary properties that are not easily, but are describable in mathematical terms, in objective terms. And then these subjective qualities, they simply belong to the subject, as the name suggests. And by the way, to be precise, these are not the words that Galileo used. This is just how this distinction has become famous later. He wrote the essayer in vulgar Italian, and the word was prevailing accidenti, or diverse affezioni for the secondary qualities, but it's not super important. And as you know, he wrote this quote. This is super famous. Probably most of you have read several times and very familiar with it. And basically, nature is written in this grand book, the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze, but it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and read the letters in which it's composed, which is the language of mathematics. Now, it's interesting, in 2019, philosopher Philip Goff claimed that the hard problems of consciousness that we face today in neuroscience, the mind-body problem, is traceable all the way back to the origin of modern science. more precisely, Goff believes that that the mind-body problem that we are stuck with today comes from a conceptual mistake that Galileo made in the Essayer. According to Goff, basically Galileo willingly relegated consciousness outside the domain of science, outside the physical world, and within the subject. And he argues that Galileo was forced to do so because Galileo believed that mathematics cannot deal with qualities. Like, how can you explain the taste of chocolate with mathematics, right? It seems difficult, at least so far. And he was seeking to advance, so to say, natural sciences through mathematics. So if mathematics cannot be applied to something, then that something maybe is not really scientific or is not really part of the natural sciences, right? And these are two quotes by Goff that sort of express this position. The problem of consciousness began when Galileo decided that science was not in the business of dealing with consciousness. Now, there is one problem with this view. Galileo, in the Essayer, doesn't claim that mathematics cannot express qualities. And this is very interesting because if we look at what primary properties are according to Galileo, like shape, size, location, blah, 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 he basically divided them in geometrical properties and arithmetical, and then there is number, which is an arithmetical properties. But then one of the primary properties is motion. And motion, according to Galileo, is neither geometrical nor arithmetical. And in this sense, motion is not mathematical at all. It can be expressed through mathematics in mathematical terms, but it's not mathematical per se, as are, for example, shape, size, location, and things like that. And if we appreciate this fact, we notice that primary properties are not essentially mathematical, right? But they can be expressed in a mathematical way. So what was actually doing Galileo when he made this distinction? And there are two answers, basically. One is a political and said Galileo was fighting for his life, basically. He was delimiting the scope of science by granting that some important stuff belonged to the soul, and the soul belonged to God, and therefore the church would oversee the soul, but science could take care of the world, like could investigate the world, right? This is the political solution. But then there is a more methodological solution, which is basically Galileo just wanted to objectifying the science in such a way that it was completely independent by the subject that was actually doing science, and basically the qualities are no longer there. The only things we have are facts. But what are facts exactly, right? And Galileo again would have an easy answer, like facts are those things that when you strip away all the subjective or the secondary qualities are left, right? Now, I'm not so convinced that Galileo was correct about that, and please appreciate my boldness for attacking one of the most accomplished individual in the world. But in fact, I think that even primary properties are subjective, right? Because of what I said before, because we cannot imagine to know something, to be in contact with something that is beyond our experience. So even when we, through abstraction, reach a description, a model, even an equation, this thing is still within our own experience. It's something that, so to say, allow me to say, we create in our mind, right? So when we make observation in science, these are conscious experience. Then, of course, it doesn't really matter. Like if we follow a certain methodology, it doesn't really matter who is doing the observation. What is necessary is that there is someone that observed, like an observant, right? In other words, what if what we call primary properties are just, again, subjective properties that are somehow less variable around subject, because maybe we can disagree if, there were, for a few years ago, the entire internet disagree on the color of a dress, right? Which is something rather subjective. But it's very difficult that you I don't know, you disagree that this glass is made of glass, in fact, right? Or about its shape, I don't know. But what if this lack of disagreement is just because these kind of properties are just less variant across subject, right? So I will accelerate a bit because I still have some stuff to say. So if I'm correct, and if I'm correct in this view that everything, we cannot even hope to go beyond our own conscious subjective experience, then it's not really a surprise that the problem framed in the way I did. But I absolutely agree, like the substrate of consciousness doesn't necessarily have to be a brain. Like in fact, I mentioned bees that don't have a proper brain the same way we do, or robots, they also don't have a brain, right? So I like to be very open on this regard, and before we have conclusive evidence, at least I wouldn't say that a brain is necessary for consciousness, right? And of course, someone could say, well, we do have conclusive evidence because the only individuals that we are sure that are conscious are human beings at this stage, and perhaps some animals, but and they do all have a very complex brain that is nothing to do with artificial intelligence or bees. But again, if there is some truth in what I said so far, then it's really not a surprise that the R problem is such an unsurmountable obstacle, right? So perhaps we should try a different way. And the way that I think we should try is, and that some people are trying, is the way that goes, instead of going from objectivity to subjectivity, instead of explain the subjective in terms of objective, we should do something that's slightly more complicated, like going from subjectivity to objectivity, and then back again, like we want to explain subjectivity in objective terms, but perhaps starting from these subjective terms. And yeah, there is this picture of Mach that some of you may have seen somewhere. So yeah, this is not very readable, but just to recap some of the things we've said so far, the most staggering feature of consciousness is intrinsicality, like the fact that consciousness is subjective in very simple terms. Consciousness doesn't just exist for me, it exists in the most fundamental way. And, even if you have a delusion, like a complete delusion, and you see things that everyone would agree that they're actually not there, those things would still be very, very true from you. And unfortunately, if you had the experience of seeing someone in this condition, it's very painful, because you realize that it's really their reality is fundamentally different from the one you are experiencing, right? And there is also a very interesting aspect that the very same moment I start doubting the existence of my own subjective experience, I'm confirming its existence. Like this is a sort of cogito ergo sum that we could adapt for our current purpose in I experience, therefore I am. This is an expression used by Professor Giulio Tononi. Then again, if nothing is more evident and directly accessible to me than my own experience, then that means that the outside world is just an inference that I made through my own experience. So I, so to say, interpret the world, the outside world, in terms of my own subjective experience. And again, this is the point I made at the beginning. While for sure we can make inferences, as I explained a bit about that, at the same time, we cannot have an absolute certainty that other people are conscious. So as far as I know, I could be the only conscious individual in existence. That would be very strange, but could be the case. I cannot have a 100% confirmation, so to say. Like, luckily, science is not about 100% confirmation. So the general story so far tell us of, you know, this incredibly complex universe that goes from the very little to the very big, and it's organized through hierarchies of scaffolded entity. And we can study these things through all the science, and there are different sciences that are appropriate to investigate different level of reality. But at the end of the day, perhaps what really matters is just what happened at the fundamental level. Like, so what we can learn from this example from quantum mechanics, really. There are, so some people could say there are only fields and particles. By the way, don't take my word for granted. Like, I'm not a physicist, so I'm drifting from my area of comfort. But more or less, this is a little bit the reductionist story that that science tells us, that a certain interpretation of science tells us. And then basically there is also another crucial important hypothesis that only fundamental entities have genuine causal interactions. Everything else at the higher level of reality merely supervene on these fundamental entities. Chalmers wrote a lot about that. So in this conception of the universe relies on what Thomas Nagel, that we mentioned earlier, called the view from nowhere. So like this complete abstraction from our personal perspective, and try to see basically with the so to say with the eye of God, right? Like a neutral third person perspective, right? So subjectivity really doesn't seem to fit in there. Now there are two problems, and the first problem, it's very simple, and maybe it can be solved, but my own experience tells me that I am a unitary being. I'm one thing, I'm one entity, and a unitary entity. You know, like I'm not. It doesn't matter to me that I'm made by, or my brain is made by neurons, and my neurons are made by some particles, and so on and so forth. I just experience life as a subject, as a one thing, as a unified whole. Moreover, this I mentioned before, somehow the view from nowhere. So this completely abstract, hypothetical, third-person, objective perspective is still a fiction of the mind, right? We need a mind to get to the view from nowhere, as Nagel called it, right? So these things seem to hint that there is something that doesn't really fit in there, right? Consciousness, I wrote, consciousness was hidden in plain sight all along. Now, a way out from this impasse, sorry, just a second. Okay, sorry. A way out could be to use phenomenology to sort of retro-engineering our own conscious experience and infer what are the physical requirements for this conscious experience to be there, right? And by phenomenology, we just mean there are like many schools of thought, but in essence, it means simply studying conscious experience from within. And this is something that we can do through introspection and reason. And starting from phenomenology is necessary to avoid the stalemate of the art problem. This is what I will argue in the next part if we have the time. In other words, we can simply following a rationalist tradition, and if consciousness is our conscious experience is the way it is, there must be a reason for that, right? So this is it's subtle but different from what is usually done. Tononi wrote that normally what is done is that we start from some plausible process, usually in the brain, or maybe some other kind of structure. But still, we start from there, and then we postulate that it would somehow give rise to experience. But clearly there is a hole, and clearly we have a problem with the art problem, and we don't really have a good answer to the mind-body problem. So this is a very long quote for one slide, but I think it's really all we need when we consider these issues. It's a quote from Schopenhauer. Of course, he didn't wrote it in 2018, but my edition was published in 2018. And the point is, materialism tries to find the first and simplest state of matter, and then to develop all the others from it, ascending from the mere mechanism to chemistry, to polarity, to the vegetable and the animal kingdom. Supposing these were successful, the last link of the chain would be animal sensitivity, or so to say, cognition. In using our language, the language we've been using tonight, we could say indeed consciousness, which in consequence would then appear as a mere modification of matter, a state of matter produced by causality. Now, if we had followed materialism thus far with clear notion, then having reached its highest point, we should experience a sudden fit of the inextinguishable laughter of the Olympians. So, in other words, what was needed, what is supposedly the highest pinnacle of this scientific endeavor, like cognition or subjective or consciousness and subjectivity, was already presupposed as the indispensable condition at the very starting point at mere matter, right? Because we need a mind to get there. So I will super briefly, because otherwise we don't have much time for questions, then I will introduce super briefly what is the approach of integrated information theory that, to my knowledge, but I think it's pretty accurate knowledge, is the only scientific endeavor that employs a similar methodology, like starting from the subjective experience to get to the required to get to the neural correlates of consciousness. So basically, consciousness is characterized by 5 axioms, which are intrinsicality, information, integration, composition, and exclusion. And these are supposed to represent, alongside with a 0th axiom, the axiom of existence, which is the one I mentioned before when I mentioned I experience, therefore I am, right? My subjective experience is undeniably true, at least from my own subjective perspective, right? And and then, as I mentioned, like intrinsicality is subjectivity, information is the specificity that our experience can assume, integration is this unitary aspect that seem to be so crucial to our mind. A composition is the fact that through introspection, we can see that our experience is composed by many features. And exclusion is the fact that our experience has somehow borders, like it's there is a clear distinction between what is within our experience and what is not, right? But before we move forward, these are within the context of integrated information theory, these are taken as the essential properties of conscious experience, but they do not describe any particular experience. They sort of provide us with a grid or like a matrix of all the possible experience. Because if you think about it, like, what would even mean to have an experience that is not integrated? Like, it would be basically as having 2 separate experiences at the same time. And I cannot even imagine what that means, right, in practical terms. At the same time, I can't really imagine what would be to have an experience that lacks of composition, so that lacks of any structure. But I've heard reports from people that use psychedelics, which are now there are now a lot of studies in neuroscience. And this perhaps it's more it's something that we could discuss if it's the case with composition that is so essential, or if it's possible, at least in principle, at least to conceive an experience that is completely destructured. I can't really do that, but if you have insight, I would be curious to listen. And yeah, so this is what IIT says are the properties of subjective experience. And then we put some assumption. By the way, so far we're just talking about subjective experience. We don't care about anything about the brain, the physical world. We're just talking what are the properties of experience. But if we throw in three working assumptions, an assumption of realism, so essentially the idea that there is a world out there that is mind independent. So I'm not proposing you full-fledged idealism a la Berkeley, but it's what I believe it's something more closer to Kant idealism, if you're familiar with it. So there is an outside world, there is a mind-independent world, something that we do not create, but is out there. And this word is sort of it's physical, as in made of cause and effect power, and we can also have an assumption of reductionism, like we can partition and manipulate the word, the physical and mind independent entities that are out there. So with this working assumption and the axiom, we can sort of translate the axiom into postulate. And by that, I mean literally just to express the axioms of consciousness in cause-effect terms. So we still, in a sense, we're still mostly concerned only about conscious experience, right? But if this is done correctly, we have expressed those properties in cause-effect terms. So at this point, if the process so far has been sound, we can now postulate, we can now propose an explanatory identity, which is a priori identity. It's not like, for example, when scientists realized that the H2O was identical to water, so to say. That was a posteriori, something that comes after experience. This is something that it's completely independent of any empirical evidence so far. This is something that we are just proposing, so to say. But why is that? Because we started from within our own experience. Our worry so far is to characterize the physical world in terms of conscious experience. And so we end up with an identity between the structure of an identity, which is an explanatory identity between the structure of phenomenal consciousness and the cause-effect structure of a physical system. Now, this is a bit quick because, yeah, the talk is getting very long, but in this way, we solved, allow me to say, and we can discuss about it if you're not convinced, because I realize I'm not argumenting it that much, but the mind-body problem is solved as the relationship between the physical and the mental is clarified by this explanatory identity. And the art problem this solves in the sense that we are not even trying anymore to explain how miraculously the physical world give rise to conscious experience. Like, we're doing the other way around. We are starting with conscious experience, and we are trying to say from within our conscious experience, how to characterize what could be a substrate which is identical to that particular experience. And with that, I thank you for listening, for the patience. I actually aim to do a shorter talk, but apparently I miscalculate the time. So please feel free to jump in the conversation and ask any question that is not clear. And there are perhaps 2 questions already, so I can.
Thank you, Francesco. If you could stop sharing your screen for a moment.
Sure.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so now,
just a second. Okay, here.
so thank you, everybody, and thank you, Francesco. We'll now open it up to all of you. If you have any questions, feel free to come in, use the raise your hand function that you can find at the bottom of your screen under reactions. In the meantime, Francesco, I don't know if you would like to answer the question that is in the chat from Steve.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, as I mentioned, I agree with that. I think it's a very punctual clarification of what I'm saying. I was perhaps talking a little bit more from the perspective of neuroscientists. So neuroscientists generally care more about specifically the brain. But again, this is a very open question. Like, for example, there is a growing body of literature about this issue. Like, can we have, or can we build an artificial consciousness which clearly doesn't have a biological brain? And there are several other examples. So absolutely, this is a very correct point, and thanks for pointing this out.
No, Cam, did you want to come in and ask your question?
Hi. Hello, Eleanor. Hello. And this has just been too brilliant as usual. Thank you so much, Francesco. I didn't really have a question, but in a funny way, I sort of did. And something pricked my ear when you said this connection between chocolate and your taste of chocolate. Mm-hmm. And I suddenly thought of consciousness and my experience of consciousness. So chocolate is there in itself, you're tasting it and you say it's chocolate, but chocolate has its own particular property, which is not your taste of it. Am I correct in that?
Sorry, can you just repeat the last?
Yeah, it's a little bit muddled, I know.
Actually, I think we just lost Francesco. I think he just maybe his internet went down.
I'm sorry, Eleanor.
No problem. We'll just wait a moment for Francesco to join us again. I think we've got him back.
Yeah, it's back. Francesco, it was just this question of your interpretation of chocolate and your taste of chocolate, which just, I found it interesting because I sort of connected it with consciousness and my experience of consciousness in the same sort of way. And I was just going to ask you, do you see a similarity between that in some way? So that chocolate is there, consciousness is there, and your taste of chocolate, your experience of chocolate, and an experience of consciousness as being the fundamental thing, it's different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think I get your point. I think it's different when we talk about consciousness, in the sense that as I try to argue during the talk, I think that consciousness or experience is also the precondition, the condition of possibility for a specific experience to be present in some way. So and I think actually this has a lot to do with the mind-body problem, like this thing specifically, like because we, for example, a lot of scientific phenomena that we investigate, we can very easily observe them directly, independently, but to observe, like, we cannot abstract from our own consciousness, right? So we cannot do the same in that sense. But sure, we can introspect our consciousness, but it's not the same thing as observing it from the outside, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I see several. Oh, Eleanor, maybe.
Yes. Yeah. Would you like to come in, Abelardo? Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you very much. Fascinating talk, Francesco. Thank you very much. There are two aspects that really catch my attention. One of them has to do with the implication of starting from the subjectivity and going outwards rather than the starting from the third person perspective. And I think that this has a set of presuppositions that are very important to consider. The social context of knowing in an intersubjective situation is something that is very different from the social situation of two parties seeing each other in a third person perspective. It's something like what Martin Buber talks about, the difference between the I and the thou, for example, if I'm now opening my internal subjectivity to you and all of you through communicating my language, through language, something that's relevant to me, but I'm having an act of faith that you'll find meaning in it. But you're also, I have permission from you to talk to you, so and so you can listen to me. So the intersubjectivity presupposes some kind of a trust relationship, it seems to me, some kind of cooperative relationship, which is very different from a lot of the science that has really been born out of more like competitive relationships in human relations. So that's my first observation. What do you think about that?
Oh, yes, that's an interesting observation that yes, I didn't think about it in those terms. Like, to be more precise, when I said we should start from the subjective and go to the objective, what I really mean by that, if we push the conclusion, like if we take my arguments, but we push the conclusion further, we actually reach to the point that there is no objectivity, in a sense. The best we can aim for is some sort of inter-shared subjectivity, which is exactly what you were talking about. And again, as you mentioned, if I understood you correctly, there are some requirements for this to be possible. Like we need to have some sort of common aspects, like some common ground where this exchange, so to say, can happen, right? So a typical example that we can do is like when we think sometimes about, for example, even, I don't know, just ChatGPT, right? And ChatGPT seems able to understand a lot of things, right? But what I suspect really happens is that ChatGPT understand or like behave in such a way that seems like understand things, because at the end of the spectrum, like both the people that coded it and the people that are using them are essentially very similar, that they have a very similar, as I mentioned, like evolutionary, developmental, and even cultural to a point, history, right? And the machine itself doesn't really do much. At the end of the chain, there has to be a sort of conscious decoder, right? Otherwise, you don't have much without that. You don't have meaning. Does this sort of satisfy your question?
Yes, it does very much. And my second observation is related to this. I have quite a bit of sympathy towards Buddhist psychology, and it seems to me that
Me too.
yeah, that the distinction that you're making there between the phenomenological dimension and the functional dimension is really clearly illustrated in the way Buddhist psychology exists and functions. Because, for example, they talk about there's 6 minds. The mental consciousness, and then each sense consciousness is a separate mind. Then they talk about the concept, for example, of mental poisons. Mental poison could be like attachment, or could be hostility, for example. And,
yeah. But I would rather characterize that as sort of content of consciousness, like not necessarily conscious functions, right?
Well, no, it is a function, because, for example, being angry towards something or someone.
Okay, yeah.
State, and it's very important for me to know when I'm angry, how I'm angry, what implications it could have, what it causes, what can I do about it, how can I communicate it. There are a lot of functions that derive from being conscious of that.
That's true. But I would say that all those functions sort of make sense, or like take meaning, so to say, because there is an underlying experience, and those functions build on top of that, right?
Yes, right.
Yes.
Yeah, and it has a social function to be able to communicate them, somehow.
That's absolutely true. The topics I went through in my talk, this is super interesting what you're saying, but the topics I went through my talk were more about so to say, the building blocks of consciousness, right? Because I think there is still such a fundamental disagreement on the very basic, right? That before we can answer more complicated question like the one you're suggesting, we should have a better, if we're talking about neuroscientific approach to consciousness, we should have a better understanding of those, so to say, building blocks. So extremely simple, like the most simple thing we can think, like the canvas of experience, so to say. And then once we have that, I believe, I assume, all higher order functions will make more sense, because because basically what I'm proposing is a shifting in the foundation of the science of the mind, and by putting consciousness at the center of it, which is currently not the case because of this history that I trace between behaviorism, functionalism, and so on. But yes, maybe I don't know if this answer you. Maybe we can take another question and come back later if you still have doubts.
Thank you.
I see several raised hands.
Thank you for coming in with your question.
Thank you very much.
Paul Groff, would you like to come in? It's great to have you here, Paul.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, hello, Francesco. My question goes back to the beginning, where you were defining consciousness, and the way you approach it, it seems to me that you equate, the way you talk about consciousness, you equate it essentially with something like pure awareness or pure subjective awareness. Is that correct? Because I think it's very important that we are clear on the definition of what we're talking.
That's definitely true. I strive for clarity, but I wouldn't say that I equate the two things. Meaning that what I mean is that the different contents of consciousness, or different more complex aspects of consciousness, are not necessary nor sufficient for having conscious experience. So yes, there is a sense in which I sort of like try to paint a white canvas of consciousness, which can be akin to pure awareness, but I'm not saying that you that you need to have pure awareness to have conscious experience. Obviously, there is something that has to go in there too. But still, an experience of pure awareness is still an experience. Absolutely, that's correct. Perhaps I haven't fully understood your question, and I don't want to seem that I elude your question, but does this kind of answer you, or?
Yes, no, I understand. Yeah.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Trevor, please come in.
Thank you. Thank you, Francesco. So I've got a little bit of a background in neuroscience and as a previous medic and the way the body physiology works. And I'm aware that modern approaches to quantum theory and the way sensory systems, the sensory receptors, are often working at a quantum level so that inputs to the nervous system are actually direct contacts with the physical world. So I wonder whether the fact that a lot of philosophical history is around the fact that we cannot have direct knowledge of things in our environment, in fact, is being undermined by quantum theory because we are actually participators in this quantum level of the world. But once it goes into the nervous system, so there is a direct knowledge of our embodiment, our whole embodiment, not just the brain, but every bit of us is embedded in this quantum level of movement that's on the go. It then passes up through various filters in the core of the brain before coming on up to the cerebral cortex. And those filters start resorting what's going on. And that is certainly true where the mind becomes differentiated from that direct knowledge that we have. But I have a feeling that philosophically that's quite important. And where I'm coming back to with this is that you come to integrated information theory at the end, which I found quite interesting. But the first two items in it, the work I'm doing is looking at getting away from the Shannon interpretation of information into a more direct, relational, the original idea of knowing being a participatory process, a mutuality of movement that's going on. But when that first term, intrinsicality, I don't know what that means. And I just wondered whether you'd fill that out, because that might help me to move on in what I'm doing and trying to connect it in with integrated information theory. What's meant by intrinsicality?
Absolutely. So let me start by the beginning. So just to show all my hands, I know nothing about quantum mechanics, so I know that there are approaches nowadays that take quantum mechanics into account and they believe that the quantum level is the level of explanation for the neuroscientific theory of consciousness. But I personally am outside of that, so I won't talk about things that I don't know. But thank you for the input anyway. Now, integrated information theory, you mentioned Shannon information, right? And you say that rightfully so, I think, that Shannon information doesn't really seem helpful when we are talking about consciousness, right? I completely agree with you. And for this reason, the proponents of integrated information theory, like Giulio Tononi and his collaborator, they moved away from Shannon information quite earlier in the process. Like, integrated information has been developed for more than 20 years now officially, but if you go back in the 90s, there already been several publications of it. And in fact, they've been developed something that, and I mentioned this because it relates directly to your question, something that is called intrinsic information. Okay, so now information in IIT is very different from Shannon information. Information in IIT is causal in nature, and this relates with the fact that I mentioned around the end of the talk about cause-effect power. And by the way, this was super briefly I didn't do any justice to integrated information theory. Hopefully tomorrow, Liad Mudrik would talk more about it, at least from an empirical point of view, and Matteo Grasso as well. But by intrinsic, I mean exactly that it's different from the way the word is used in the philosophical literature, where intrinsicality has its own history, so to say, its own baggage. In integrated information theory, it simply means that my experience exists for me. It's another way that, in a more simple way, we could say it's a way to say experience is subjective. But I can provide you, I recommend you, if you're interested in integrated information theory, there is a recent paper which came out in 20, I have a void, 23 or 24, and it's by Albantakis and et al., and all the collaborators of Professor Lutononi, and it's called Integrated Information Theory 4.0. It's like the fourth iteration of the theory, so to say, and it came out very recently. The preprint came out 1 year ago, so I don't remember exactly now when the paper was officially published, but you can find the preprint online, and it's I super recommended read for everyone. Thank you very much for your question.
Yeah, thank you. I would simply say that the issue of causality, I'm just wondering whether we need to be looking at mutuality rather than linear causality all the time, that we're actually feeding into the system as much as we're receiving from it. And that's the participatory nature of consciousness, possibly that might come along with it. But thank you. That does move me forward. Thank you very much.
Oh, and by the way, I think someone posted the article in the chat. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I forgot that. Thank you.
So you have the link there. Okay. Next question.
Steve. Yeah, Steve, please come in.
Yes, thank you, Francisco. It's a great background talk here. I just wanted to clarify the comment that I made about the hard problem, maybe motivate it a little more. The most neuroscientists right now would agree that the brain is heavily involved in prediction and inference. The active inference view of Carl Friston and promoted by people like Anil Seth and so on. So we're constantly making inferences and drawing conclusions from whatever we're experiencing. And hold
on 1 minute, Steve. I see that we lost Francesco again. So let's just wait a moment for him to jump back on this call. There he is. Okay, we got him back.
There he is. He's back.
Okay, go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay. He's muted.
Yeah, Francesco, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I apologize. Is the app of Zoom keep crashing for no reason and start itself again? So
all good. Don't worry. No worries.
You were talking about Carl Friston, the brain that makes constantly predictions and inferences, right?
Yes, and so one of the biggest inferences that the human civilization has made is about the nature of the physical world being entirely physical and governed, so to speak, by laws of nature. So when we think of anything physical, we think of laws of nature controlling what's going on, not necessarily as if they were out there in some super phenomenal realm or super physical realm, but it's as if the natural processes going on have no choice. They just happen because of cause and effect, as in the previous discussion. And the point I would insert is perhaps science needs to reevaluate these as fundamental assumptions about the primacy of cause and effect and the cast in stone laws of nature, and think more in terms of fundamental processes themselves, also possibly involving a sensory quality, so that it's it systematically appears to be laws of nature, but it also is an unfolding based on experience and the state of the individual system that's having the experience. It's a different way of looking at things.
No, absolutely. That's 100% agree with you. Like so when I mentioned cause and effect power, I was thinking about a very old description of existence in physical terms that is provided in by the stranger of Elea in the Parmenides by Plato, which basically says that if you want to know if something exists, like a criteria to determine existence is if something can take and can cause or take an effect, right? So it basically is something that you can get into a causal relationship. But I agree with you, like the real point, like these are very useful inferences, and then they prompt an impressive technological development, but I think it shouldn't be the foundation for a richer metaphysical description of the world, basically. Yeah. And by the way, I believe we will hear a lot more about the free energy principle and all the related topic by Maxwell Ramstead. That is one of the greatest voice in from that camp. I'm definitely not too qualified to talk about it, but thank you very much for your question. And
yeah, I hope he clarifies Friston's work for all of us. It's a hard nut to crack to get through all that.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for coming in. And we'll take the last question now from Raymond. Thank you, Raymond. Do come in.
Thank you very much for your comprehensive talk today. I might be jumping ahead to one of the next 5 presentations, but for me, it's somewhat reductionist to believe that science alone is capable of approaching the question of consciousness. So you suggested instead of going from the objective to the subjective, reverse that and go from the subjective to the objective. We're still within the realm of the scientific way. For me, it seems that consciousness itself would transcend the dualisms of mind, body, subject, object, and therefore I just refer to the very ancient spiritual methods. They too start with individual consciousness, but their route is to go from, in my understanding, from individual consciousness through meditation. It's a different way that the Tao is called the way from individual consciousness to cosmic consciousness. And that can be experienced, even if momentarily, by an individual. And you would reach an awareness, a perception, an experience of consciousness itself. And that revelation was interesting because I looked at your 5 axioms of integrated information theory. And as you were doing that, I was writing my own axioms for this Eastern spiritual revelation. You may come up with the idea, the axioms that consciousness is spatial, triaxial, unitive, holistic, temporal, and essentially creative.
Right. So first of all, thank you for this this insight into the topic. I think it's very important to basically sometimes to delimitate the scope of your research, right? So I personally am interested into scientific explanation of consciousness, but then I completely agree with you. Like it's not that you know, I personally I believe science is all but boring and cold, and you know I think science is life, but but you know, I don't have the expectation, for example, from science to have straightforward ethical answers. Like, I believe we need philosophy. And by the way, I'm not a neuroscientist. I'm a philosopher. From my education is being completely in philosophy up until my PhD, where I started to be a little bit more interdisciplinary. But I believe there is a lot in life that is not necessarily fully explained by science. And for example, I don't think science, I wouldn't even been able to imagine what science could say about like the meaning of life, for example, right? But I believe that there are a lot of things that can be said about the meaning of life. It's something very important. And you know, what makes life worth to be lived. Maybe there are, you know, actually scientific account that could you know, relate between happiness and purposefulness. I don't know, but I really don't think we can even aim to that kind of very big questions. And I think those questions are outside the purview of science. So I completely agree with you that you know, the one can embark on a personal quest, and you know, I personally, I didn't have the time to talk much about IIT, but like personally, I'm not sure of what you mean by universal consciousness. And I personally, I don't believe there is such thing. I believe that, or like, I believe there is no such, I don't understand such thing. I understand my own conscious experience, right? But I'm not entirely sure about that. And but if we talk about something that maybe I can relate a bit more, like, for example, meaning of life or purpose and things like that, again, I don't think science is strictly necessary to deal with that. And coming on, you brought up some axioms, I think. The last part of your question, sorry.
Well, these were just coming right off the top of my head as you were listing some things, but and they're just personal beliefs of my own. Sure.
No, I just meant that I just wanted to clarify, like, in IIT, by axiom, it's meant something that is an essential property of experience, so that we cannot imagine, we cannot even, conceive an experience that is missing one of those properties. So, for example, if I remember correctly, one of the things you brought up, for example, was spatiality, right? And I think it's possible to have experiences that do not necessarily have extendedness, like this subjective quality of this subjective spatial quality, and therefore I wouldn't consider it an essential axiom of consciousness. But yeah, we can talk about that more.
And I agree with you. And I'm not trying to find against science at all. We've kind of been put in a position, I call it either or. Either you are going to take the scientific position or the spiritual position. When in my position, it's in my belief, it seems that what's so exciting about what's happening recently is we're getting to the point of both and, that they're complementary ways of looking at things, the scientific and the spiritual, and there's some greater holistic way that they're going to be integrated.
No, I absolutely, I don't believe, actually, I don't really believe that science and spirituality are mutually exclusive, as I think they're both, in different way, perhaps, they're both anti-dogmatic stance that we take, right? And so when you are not dogmatic, the problem, I think, is when you have some very strict or extreme interpretation of some concept and you take it as a dogma, whether it's science, and then we use the expression sometimes scientism, right, when this happens, or for example in religion we know that extremism can lead to bad things, but I think that if you stay open and don't take a very dogmatic stance, you can include a plurality of things. And by the way, I learned this thing, but like I really started reflecting about that in Paris last September. So I really thought about a lot about living with one own contradiction. So yeah, thank you very much for your.
Oh,
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Well, we have gone a little over time. Thank you, Francesco. Do you have any closing remarks?
My closing remark is enjoy the dinner if you are in Europe, and see you tomorrow if you will attend the topic, and I highly encourage you to be here tomorrow.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So we will see you tomorrow for consciousness and the brain, comparing and testing neuroscientific theories of consciousness. Thank you everyone for being here today. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow as we continue on this journey. Thank you, everybody.